Thank you so much. Our next speaker on voter rights is Dr. Vicky Woeste.
Where is my remote? There we go. Thank you. You ready? Y'all are getting pictures today. Okay, here we go. So good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name's Vicky Woeste, and I'm here today representing the Lafayette chapter of the ACLU, which, as it turns out, is doing a postcard campaign on the subject I'm talking about, voter rights, in particular redistricting reform. So if you haven't yet signed a short postcard to your state rep and state senator, stop by the ACLU table and we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the vote is administered in this country. I'm a historian by training, and if I had the time and had a guarantee that I wouldn't bore you all to sobs, I would go back in time, at least to that definitive election of 2000, which turned on little pieces of paper hanging off of ballots. That's, however, I think when we can conclusively say the modern fixation with voter integrity began. That's when we mechanized, digitized our voting procedures, and in a way we haven't really known for sure if the vote counts have been accurate ever since. But for today, I'm just going to go back to 2008 and 2004. In 2008, turnout was 131 million people. Yes, doggone it, especially because that represented an increase of 5 million over 2004. And that was let's see, so under citizens registered and percent, I don't know if this has a, one of those red dot things. Anyway, that, really? Oh, there we go. See, 71%, it's right there. So if the data say 71%, it must in fact be true. But the funny thing about 2008, reliably red states, such as the one we live in, went blue by however small a margin. And that scared the bleep out of the Republicans. So this very recent wave of strict voter ID laws actually began after the 2008 election. And in Indiana in particular, our Secretary of State, who implemented the first voter ID law, is now our member of Congress and senatorial hopeful Todd Rokita. Yeah, he's not my favorite either. Ask me afterwards how he made my oldest daughter cry when she was still in high school. I love telling that story. Anyway, so this wave of state laws designed to protect the ballot included voter ID laws in 33 states. And these voter ID laws specified that it had to be a particular kind of ID. It had to be issued by the state. So that meant either a driver's license or a state-issued ID card. And there were also stricter requirements for voting absentee and voting early. Although, to be fair, Tippecanoe County is actually one of the best states in Indiana for early voting. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. But this wave of voter ID laws passed after 2009 had predictable effects. Turnout went down. In the 2014 midterm elections, Indiana's turnout was 24% of eligible voters. That was the worst in the nation. That's not a status we should want. Now, the Indiana photo ID law actually got litigated. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Hoosier native Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion for the Supreme Court, upholding the law as not constituting an unreasonable burden on people seeking to vote. The real irony here is that the plaintiffs in this case were nuns from his home county of St. Joseph's who were in their 80s and 90s and hadn't gotten state IDs or driver's licenses in decades. So yes, actually, those plaintiffs, they were unreasonably burdened. So the law remains on the books here in Indiana and in most other states where they've been enacted. The only thing that's been changed is that it's now possible for college students. How many of you go to Purdue? College students? Yay. Your photo ID from Purdue can be used to vote as long as you vote at Purdue. If you want to vote in a voting center in the rest of the county, you can't do that. You have to use a driver's license or a state ID. And that kind of brings up, a host of problems. Like, for instance, in many states, particularly in the South, particularly among African Americans, the elderly do not have proof of their citizenship. They don't have birth certificates. And it's an onerous burden to pay for birth certificates for some people. Yes. And so as a result, this situation has produced the cruel irony in which children of former slaves and former indentured servants who are now quite up in age can't cast a ballot. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. The other thing that's happened as a result of the Obama victory in 2008 is that states have become party to outright voter suppression efforts. The most startling example of this is the state of Wisconsin. You'll all remember Wisconsin was one of the 3 states that was, possibly going to go into a recount. It was one of 3 states that handed Trump the Electoral College, his landslide, right? He won that state by 22,748 votes. Well, the social scientists have crunched the numbers, and they have concluded that over 200,000 people in Wisconsin were unable to cast ballots. 200,000 people, the lost voters. And I can see how this would happen because I stood in the Purdue Memorial Union on November 8th of 2016, helping to direct college students who were there to vote, most of them for the first time, most of them voting for president for the first time. And about half of the students that came to stand in line to vote there couldn't vote. They hadn't cast absentee ballots in the county of their official legal residence, and you couldn't register on the day of the election in Tippecanoe County. Registration's cut off 30 days ahead of the election. So if you haven't changed your registration or made certain to get an absentee ballot, you are out of luck on election day. That was heartbreaking to me, to watch those, to have to disappoint students and tell them that they couldn't vote. So, let me tell you about how these post-Obama laws have affected voting. States with no new voter ID laws had an increased turnout averaging about 1.3%. This handy-dandy map up here, notice there's only one state, Minnesota, that managed to get 74% or more of its voters out to the polls. And Indiana is in that yellow, very pale yellow category. So we got under 60%. It doesn't take too much awareness of history or of current events to know that what people take for granted here in our country, the idea that you can go and vote in our elections, that's a vote people have died for in other countries and here. 50 years ago, Black and white Americans were murdered for registering people to vote. It's sacred. It's not more sacred than any other right, but it is a sacred and fundamental right, and we should treat it as such. Thank you. So I've told you how Wisconsin's voters turnout dropped by 3.3%. And many of those lost voters in Wisconsin and elsewhere were African Americans and other traditionally Democratic voting groups. For instance, in Mississippi and Virginia, other states that adopted the strict voter ID laws, the turnout was down 1.17% from 2012. That may not seem like much, but again, these are states where the winning margin was not that big. And in these three states, Virginia, Mississippi, and Wisconsin, about 400,000 votes were lost to suppression. That could have changed our history. That right there is the difference between President Pussy Grabber in Chief and President Hillary Clinton. So don't ever think that your vote doesn't count. Here's what we're dealing with right now. In January of 2017, our Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, knocked 500,000 people off the ballot in Indiana. She determined that they had not voted. This is not just a one-off thing. This is really scary. This is part of a larger movement in places like Ohio. Whoops, I missed this. Well, I told you what that data was. So change to strict voting rights, turnout was down almost 2%. Okay, but what I want to show you here is Ohio's use it or lose it approach, which is exactly what Connie Lawson did. If you haven't exercised your right to vote, it will be taken away from you. About what other constitutional right can that be said? God knows it's not being applied to the right to bear arms, right? I have never once applied to carry a firearm, but I could still go in and do it tomorrow and nobody would stop me. Okay, that's Kathy Parker's gig. I'll let her do that. But this is what's really scary. The Supreme Court heard arguments in this case challenging the use it or lose it standard last week. And hopefully, Justice Kennedy will do the right thing and vote on the correct side of the issue. And it might even overturn Indiana's purge of the ballot lists last year. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I forget how much time I've taken already, so bear with me. My conclusions are this. The Republicans in state governments where the vote is administered, where elections are run, have made no secret of their goal. Their goal is to reduce participation in elections. That's not our goal. Our goal is that every eligible citizen, including former felons, should have the right to vote and should be encouraged to vote. And the vote should be made more accessible, easier to do, and not require a burden, a financial burden, a logistical burden on our citizens. We can do this. We can do this. Now, there's some good news. As you all know, probably, the Trump administration's Voter Integrity Commission, which was led by Vice President Pence, that kind of sticks in my throat still, has been dissolved. The vast majority of states refused to turn over their voter data, and most of those states have Republican secretaries of state. So this was not a partisan rejection. This was Republican secretaries of state actually standing up and obeying their own state laws. So that was a good thing. But we have to remain vigilant. Remember Trump's claim after the election that 3 million non-citizens voted in the election? A complete lie, a complete untruth, a complete and utter falsehood. But that's the narrative. That's what we have to keep fighting. Because every time the media report on that story, on that claim, they reiterate it without sufficiently debunking it. So here's what I think we need to do. First and foremost, we have got to change the narrative. It's absolutely and completely not the case that non-citizens and other ineligible people are voting in our elections. It is not the case that we suffer from dangerous amounts of voter fraud in this country. It's not true, and don't let anybody say that in your presence. It's not true. The only example of voter fraud uncovered in 2016 was in Iowa, where some woman decided to vote for Trump twice because doing it once wasn't enough, I guess. That's the reality. Voter fraud is not a problem here. The problem here is voter suppression. People who have the right to vote are being denied that right. So here's what I want to push for. Changing the narrative, that's one thing. Number two, same-day voter registration. We have the technology. We can rebuild it. It will not take that much to do, because the voter registration gets run through the BMV, and the BMV database is statewide. There is no reason whatever that somebody from Marion County going to Purdue cannot cast a ballot for his or her home precinct here at Purdue. All you have to do is program the machine. It's not that difficult. There is no technological reason why we couldn't do this. Okay, we need to push back against the proposal that's before the legislature right now that will reduce early voting from 28 days to 18. That's another, I mean, come on. It's hitting us in the face. They don't want us to vote. That's wrong. We need to enable people to vote by mail, not just absentee voters, but anybody. Or online. I cast ballots in my professional associations. It's totally secure. I can only vote once. I'm sorry, but if the American Historical Association can run an election that way, then every single state in the union ought to be able to do it. It's not brain surgery, okay? And then the last thing, as I said, as we're doing at the ACLU table, push for independent, nonpartisan redistricting. We are not going to be able to fix these imbalances of power in the legislature until we get fair districts drawn. Why should Indiana Republicans be able to win 55% of the vote and hold 70% of the seats in the legislature? It's wrong. It's unfair. It's unrepresentative and therefore undemocratic, dare I say. Okay. Here's a fun example to send you away with. This is the county-by-county map of the results in the special Senate election last month, in which, yay, Doug Jones beat the pedophile, Roy Moore. Now, Jones won the election, 671,000 votes to 650,000 votes. It was a 1.5% margin and well beyond that which, the size needed for an automatic recount. Okay, that's a pretty decent showing in Alabama. Look at all those dark and light blue counties. Yay! Now look at the results mapped by, don't worry about that, congressional districts. He only won one district. He won Congressional District 7. That's how gerrymandering works, okay? Look at these little fingers of Congressional District 7. Those fingers capture the African American neighborhoods in the cities of Monroeville, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, and Birmingham. All of those black voters have been scrunched into one district through the contortion of geography. I mean, look at Congressional District 4. It's just as bad. I mean, it goes all the way from east to west, and look at these. Look at these weird geographic lines. And I can tell you who drew those maps. The RNC did it. The RNC drew every legislative map at the state level, and it drew the congressional districts too. So we know what we're up against. We do. But it's essential that we keep the pressure on the legislature in our state to fix this. So that's your homework assignment. Thank you, everyone.